The storm did not arrive gently. It came like a warning the city chose to ignore, rolling in with a heavy sky and violent winds that bent the streetlights into trembling silhouettes. Rain struck the pavement in relentless sheets, blurring the world into streaks of silver and shadow. Thunder cracked overhead, not distant, not soft, but close enough to feel in the bones, like something ancient tearing through the night. And through that chaos, a black car slid to a stop in front of a building that did not exist on any public record. Ilara Vance stepped out alone. The cold hit her instantly, sharp against her skin, but it was nothing compared to the pain twisting deep inside her body. Another contraction gripped her without mercy, stealing the breath from her lungs. She bent slightly, one hand clutching her stomach, the other gripping the edge of the car door as if it were the only thing holding her upright. For a moment, the world narrowed into that pain, into the pulse of it, into the unbearable reality that this was happening now, and he wasn't here. The driver hesitated, unsure whether to help, but the moment the clinic doors opened, two men in dark coats moved quickly toward her. Silent, efficient, their presence more shadow than flesh. They did not ask questions. They already knew who she was. Everyone knew who she was. The wife of Mafia Boss. They guided her inside without a word, shielding her from the rain, from the storm, from the world that would never dare touch her, yet could not protect her from this. Inside, the clinic was quiet, almost eerily so. Soft lighting replaced the chaos outside, warm tones meant to soothe, but nothing could soften the sharp edge of reality pressing down on her chest. Her footsteps echoed faintly as they moved her through the corridor, past doors that concealed secrets, past walls that had witnessed things no one spoke about. This place was safe, secure, controlled. But it felt empty. Another contraction came.
Hi, YouTube family. This is my channel where I create slow burn mafia romance stories, stories about revenge, karma, love, and power. Stories where broken people rise again, where silence speaks louder than words. But right now, this channel is demonetized. That means I can't earn from these videos anymore. And continuing daily uploads has become very difficult. If you enjoy these stories, if they make you feel something, if you want this journey to continue, you can support me. Even a small donation helps me keep creating, writing, and uploading new stories for you every day. Your support means everything. You can show your support by buying me a coffee, link in bio. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you for helping these stories live.
From her lips before she could stop it. The sound seemed too loud in the silence, too raw. A nurse rushed forward, her expression calm but alert, guiding Ilara onto a waiting stretcher. "You're safe," the nurse said softly, her voice steady, practiced. Safe. The word lingered in Ilara's mind, but it felt hollow. Because safety was not what she needed. Not tonight. They wheeled her down the hallway, the ceiling lights passing above her in a slow blur, each one flickering across her vision like fragments of something breaking apart. Her hand tightened around her phone, her fingers trembling not just from pain, but from something deeper, something far more fragile. Hope. She had called him. Again and again. Each time the line had rung, her heart had lifted just slightly, clinging to the belief that he would answer, that he would hear her, that he would come. But the silence had answered instead. Cold, indifferent, final. Another flash of lightning illuminated the windows at the end of the corridor, and for a second, the storm outside reflected in the glass like a living thing, violent and unstoppable. Just like the truth she was trying not to face. Hours earlier, she had stood in the doorway of their estate, watching him adjust his cufflinks with that same composed expression he wore when making decisions that changed lives. He had barely looked at her. His attention was already elsewhere, already pulled toward the night waiting for him, toward Selene Marquez. The name burned. Selene, with her effortless confidence, her calculated smile, her presence that seemed to wrap around Pahir like a slow, tightening coil. An alliance, they called it, a necessary connection. But Ilara had seen the way Selene looked at him. And worse, she had seen the way he didn't look away. "I'll be back before anything happens," he had said. Simple words. Careless words. She had wanted to believe them. Now, as another wave of pain tore through her, those words felt like a lie that echoed too loudly in her mind. The room they brought her into was prepared, immaculate, controlled. Machines hummed softly, Doctors moved with quiet precision, voices low and steady. Everything was exactly as it should be. Except for one thing: the empty space beside her. Her breathing grew uneven as the realization began to settle, not all at once, but slowly, like a weight pressing deeper and deeper into her chest. He wasn't coming. Not because he couldn't. Because he didn't. The truth landed harder than any contraction, sharper than any pain her body could produce. It carved through her thoughts, through her expectations, through every fragile piece of trust she had been holding onto. Tears slipped silently from the corners of her eyes, disappearing into her hair as she stared at the ceiling. The storm raged outside, thunder rolling like distant war drums, but inside, everything felt unbearably still. Her hand moved instinctively to her stomach, trembling as she felt the life within her, the small, fragile existence that depended entirely on her. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice breaking despite her effort to stay strong. "I'm here, I won't leave you." The words were not for him. They never would be again. Another contraction came, and this time she didn't fight it. She let it take her, let it break through the last illusion she had been holding onto, because there was nothing left to hold. No promise, no partnership, no shared moment waiting on the other side of this pain. Only her, only this child, and the quiet, devastating understanding that settled deep in her soul. She was going to bring this life into the world alone. From the pain should have been beside her had already chosen something else. The night did not soften for anyone, but in another part of the city, far from the storm-lashed silence of the clinic, it roared with a different kind of violence, one made of power, deception, and carefully hidden intentions. Beneath a towering building of glass and steel, concealed behind layers of security and coded entrances, the underworld gathered where no outsider could reach. The air inside the private casino pulsed with heat and ambition, thick with cigar smoke and the quiet clink of crystal glasses. Laughter rose in controlled bursts, never too loud, never too free, because every man in that room understood one truth: this was not a place for joy, only for advantage. At the center of it all stood Pahir Voss. He did not raise his voice, did not demand attention, yet the entire room bent subtly around him. His presence was not loud but absolute. Men watched him from the corners of their eyes, measuring him, fearing him, needing him. He wore control like a second skin, his expression unreadable, his posture relaxed in a way that only truly dangerous men could afford. Deals were being made tonight that would redraw invisible borders, alliances that could either secure empires or burn them to the ground. And Pahir was at the center of it, exactly where he had always believed he belonged. Beside him, Selene Marquez leaned just close enough to blur the line between business and something far more dangerous. Her hand rested lightly on his arm as she spoke, her voice smooth, almost hypnotic, weaving through the noise of the room as if it were meant only for him. She was dressed in silver that caught every flicker of light, every movement deliberate, every glance calculated. To anyone watching, she was the perfect partner for a man like Pahir, beautiful, composed, untouchable. But beneath that elegance was something sharper, something that did not belong to loyalty. "You're distracted tonight," she murmured, her lips curving into a faint smile as her eyes studied him with unsettling precision. "That's unlike you." Pahir exhaled slowly, taking a sip of his drink, the burn of it grounding him. "I'm exactly where I need to be," he replied, his tone steady, but there was a fraction of a pause, something so small it would have gone unnoticed by anyone else, anyone but her. Selene noticed everything. "And yet," she continued softly, her fingers brushing his sleeve in a way that seemed accidental but wasn't, "your mind isn't here." Her gaze lingered on him, searching, pressing. "Tell me, what could possibly pull you away from a night like this?" For a moment, the sound of thunder echoed faintly through the walls, distant but real, like a reminder that the world outside still existed. Pahir's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone, the screen lighting up against the dim glow of the room. Missed calls. One after another. Ilara. Her name stared back at him, silent, insistent. A flicker of something passed through him, sharp and unwelcome. He could almost hear her voice, the way it would sound right now, strained, breathless, afraid. The image came too quickly, too clearly, and for a second it disrupted the careful balance he had built inside himself. "She can wait," Selene said quietly, as if she had reached inside his thoughts and rearranged them. Her voice was softer now, almost intimate, but beneath it was something colder, something guiding. "Tonight is bigger than domestic concerns." Domestic concerns. The words settled heavily, reshaping the moment, dulling the urgency that had tried to rise within him. Pahir stared at the screen for another second, then turned it off, slipping the phone back into his pocket with deliberate calm. The decision was small, almost insignificant in the grand scheme of the empire he was protecting. That was how he justified it. That was how men like him survived. "Nothing important," he said, more to himself than to her. Selene's smile deepened, subtle and satisfied, as if something had just fallen perfectly into place. She leaned closer, her voice lowering. "Good," she whispered, "because tonight everything changes." Across the room, a group of men watched the exchange carefully, their conversations quieter now, their eyes sharper. There were currents beneath this gathering that no one spoke about openly, alliances shifting in ways that could not be undone. And somewhere within those shifting lines, Selene stood not as a guest, but as something far more dangerous. Pahir did not see it. Or perhaps he chose not to. Another deal was placed in front of him, another decision that demanded his attention, and once again he stepped into it without hesitation. This was his world. This was what he understood. Power, control, consequence. The storm outside, the calls he ignored, the woman fighting through pain somewhere far away, those things felt distant, manageable, secondary. Until they were. As the night deepened, the music grew louder, the lights more blinding, the illusions more convincing. Selene stayed close, her presence a constant whisper at his side, guiding him, distracting him, keeping him exactly where she needed him to be. And with every passing minute, with every decision made, with every call unanswered, something irreversible was unfolding beyond his reach. Because while he stood surrounded by power, believing he was in control of everything that mattered, the one moment that would define him was slipping away in silence. Pain did not come in waves anymore. It came like something alive, something relentless that refused to loosen its grip, tightening around Ilara's body with a force that made the world blur at the edges. The storm outside seemed to echo inside her now, thunder rolling through her chest, lightning splitting through her nerves as another contraction tore through her without warning. The clinic, with its polished floors and controlled silence, no longer felt like a place of safety. It felt like a battlefield where she was fighting something she could not see, something she could not stop, and worst of all, something she had to face alone. The doctors spoke to her, their voices calm, practiced, distant. Words like breathe, steady, almost there floated around her, but they struggled to reach her fully. Because beneath the physical pain, something deeper was unraveling, something far more dangerous than anything happening in her body. Her hand tightened around the thin hospital sheet, knuckles whitening as she forced herself to focus, to stay present, to not break under the weight of what she was beginning to understand. He wasn't coming. The thought did not strike her all at once. It crept in slowly, like cold seeping through a locked door, quiet and unavoidable. She had held onto hope for hours, fragile and desperate, clinging to the belief that at any moment the door would open, that he would appear, that everything would somehow still make sense, that he would choose her. But time had passed, too much time, and with every unanswered call, every silent minute, that hope had thinned into something almost invisible. Another contraction hit harder than the last, forcing a broken cry from her lips as her body curled instinctively against the pain. A nurse moved closer, her hand firm against Ilara's shoulder, grounding her. "Stay with me," she said gently, but there was urgency beneath her calm. "You're doing well. You're stronger than you think." Stronger than she thought. The words echoed, but Ilara wasn't sure she believed them, because strength in that moment felt like something distant, something she used to have when life made sense, when love felt safe, when promises still meant something. Now strength felt like survival, nothing more. Her phone lay beside her on the small metal table, the screen dark, silent, empty. She turned her head toward it just slightly, just enough to see it. For a moment she imagined it lighting up, Imagined his name appearing, imagined hearing his voice cutting through everything, telling her he was on his way. The image was so vivid it almost hurt, but the screen remained blank. A hollow ache settled in her chest, heavier than the pain in her body, because it wasn't just about him missing this moment. It was about what that absence meant, about what it revealed, about the truth she could no longer avoid. She was not his priority. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. Her breath hitched as another wave of pain surged through her, but this time something inside her shifted with it. Not weakness, not fear, something else, something sharper. Her fingers moved instinctively to her stomach, pressing gently, protectively, as if she could shield the life within her from everything outside. "I've got you," she whispered, her voice trembling but steady enough to hold meaning. "I won't let anything happen to you, not this world, not him, no one." The words changed something. They anchored her. Because suddenly, this was no longer about waiting, no longer about hoping, no longer about whether he would walk through that door. This was about her, about the child she was bringing into a world that did not wait for anyone, that did not forgive weakness, that did not care about promises broken in the dark. The storm outside intensified, rain hammering against the windows, wind howling like something alive. But inside the room, a different kind of storm was reaching its peak. The doctors moved with sharper focus now, their voices firmer, more direct. "It's time," one of them said, and the words cut through everything else. Time for what could not be undone, for what could not be delayed, for what would define everything that came after. Alara's body trembled as she tried to steady her breathing, her vision swimming as pain and exhaustion collided. She felt like she was standing at the edge of something vast and irreversible, something that would change her completely, whether she was ready or not. And somewhere deep inside her, beneath the fear, beneath the heartbreak, something began to rise. Not hope, not anymore. Something stronger, something unbreakable. Because in that moment, as the storm raged and the world narrowed to a single, consuming reality, Alara Vance understood one truth with absolute clarity. She was not waiting for him anymore. Whatever came next, she would face it without him. The storm had not calmed. It had deepened, thickened, as if the sky itself refused to look away from what was unfolding beneath it. Thunder rolled in heavy, suffocating waves, pressing against the reinforced walls of the hidden clinic, while inside, the air had turned sharp with urgency. Time no longer moved in minutes. It fractured into seconds, each one stretched, strained, and pulled tight by the intensity of what was about to happen. Alara could feel it in her bones, in the trembling of her hands, in the way her breath came in broken pieces that refused to settle. The pain reached a new level, something beyond anything she had known before. It no longer came and went. It consumed. It held her in place, demanded everything from her, left no space for doubt or fear or even thought. The voices around her blurred into something distant, almost unreal, but one thing cut through clearly: the command to push, to fight, to survive. And she did. Every part of her resisted the urge to break. Her fingers clenched tightly around the sheets, her body straining against the force tearing through her, and somewhere inside, something fierce rose up to meet it. Not because she wasn't afraid, not because she wasn't exhausted, but because she had no other choice. Because there was someone depending on her now in a way no one ever had before. Another contraction hit, sharper than the last, forcing a cry from her lips that echoed against the walls. It was raw, stripped of control, but it carried something else with it: defiance. A refusal to give in, to collapse under the weight of everything she had lost in this single night. The doctors moved closer, their voices more urgent now, guiding her, pushing her forward through the chaos of pain. "You're almost there," one of them said, steady and firm. "Don't stop now." Almost. The word felt unreal, like something too distant to trust, yet it anchored her in that moment. Because if this was the end of the pain, then it was also the beginning of something else. Something unknown, something permanent. Her mind flickered for a brief second, betraying her, dragging her back to a memory she didn't want. The image of him, Pahir, the way he had looked when he walked away earlier that night, composed, untouched, already moving towards something else, towards someone else. The memory burned, but this time it didn't break her. It hardened her. Because she understood now. That moment had not just been him leaving the room. It had been him choosing a different world, one that did not include her, one that did not include this. Another surge of pain pulled her back violently, forcing her to focus again, to stay present, to not let the past weaken what she needed to do now. Her breathing became uneven, her vision blurred, but she held on. She had to. Now, the doctor said, louder this time, push. And she did, with everything she had left. The room seemed to close in, every sound fading into a low hum as the moment stretched, tightened, and then silence. Not the quiet kind, not the peaceful kind, but a sudden, suffocating stillness that pressed down on everyone in the room at once. The kind of silence that did not belong in a place where life was supposed to begin. Ilara's heart stopped. Her chest tightened, panic rising instantly, violently, before she could stop it. The world narrowed to that silence, to the absence of something that should have been there. Her breath caught in her throat, her fingers tightening instinctively as fear clawed its way through her. Why isn't she crying? The question escaped her before she could hold it back, her voice trembling, fragile, breaking under the weight of that moment. The doctors moved quickly, too quickly, their calm shifting into something more controlled, more urgent. A nurse lifted the small, fragile body, moving with practiced precision, but Ilara could see it. The tension, the focus, the unspoken awareness that something was wrong. No, the word slipped from her lips, barely audible, but filled with a fear so deep it threatened to swallow her whole. For a heartbeat, the storm outside seemed to pause with her. And then, a cry. Small, sharp, alive. It cut through the silence like lightning, sudden and undeniable, filling the room with something that did not belong to fear. Relief crashed over her so violently it left her breathless, her body trembling as tears spilled freely down her face. The sound of that cry rewrote everything. It pushed back the darkness, the doubt, the pain. She was here. Her baby was here. The nurse moved closer, placing the tiny, fragile life gently into her arms, and for a moment Ilara forgot how to breathe. The world stilled again, but this time it was different. Softer, warmer, real. The baby's skin was delicate, her features small and perfect in a way that felt almost impossible. A tiny hand shifted, curling instinctively, reaching for something it didn't yet understand. Ilara's heart shattered and rebuilt in the same second. "You're safe," she whispered, her voice breaking as she held her closer. "I've got you." No one else had been there to say it. So she would. Her gaze lingered on the small face, memorizing every detail, every breath, every movement. And then something settled deep inside her, something quiet but absolute. She would name her. Not with his presence, not with his approval, but with her own strength. "Sienna," she murmured softly, the name falling into place like it had always belonged there. "Your name is Sienna." The baby stirred slightly, as if the world itself had acknowledged it. Ilara pressed her lips gently against her daughter's forehead, her eyes closing for a brief moment as everything finally caught up to her. The pain, the storm, the betrayal, and the truth. Because as she held her daughter close, feeling the warmth of her, the steady rhythm of her small breaths, one thing became undeniable. He had missed it. Not just the moment, not just the birth, but something far greater. And no matter what happened next, he would never get that moment back. Morning did not arrive gently for Pahir Voss. It forced itself into the room through a thin line of gray light slipping past the blackout curtains, cutting across the marble floor like a blade. The air was stale, heavy with the remnants of a night that should have meant power, victory, control, but instead carried something hollow, something unfinished. He lay still for a moment, eyes half open, his mind caught between fragments of memory that refused to settle into a clear shape. Laughter, glasses clinking. Selini's voice, low and smooth, threading through the noise. And beneath it all, something else, something he had chosen not to hear. His phone vibrated somewhere nearby, a dull, persistent sound that broke through the haze in his head. At first, he ignored it. It had been vibrating all night, or at least it felt that way, a background irritation he had dismissed with practiced ease. But this time it didn't stop. It kept going, insistent, almost aggressive, as if it refused to be ignored any longer. With a slow breath, he pushed himself upright, running a hand through his hair, his movements heavy with the aftertaste of alcohol and something far less tangible. The room around him came into focus, a private suite, too quiet, too clean for what had taken place hours earlier. Selene was gone, or perhaps she had never truly been there in the way it mattered. It didn't matter. None of it should have mattered. And yet, as he reached for his phone, something tightened in his chest without warning. The screen lit up. Missed calls. Too many. All from one name. Ilara. For a moment his expression didn't change. It was a familiar sight after all. She had called before, during late nights, during meetings, during moments when he had chosen not to answer. But something about the number, the repetition, the urgency of it, felt different this time. His thumb hovered over the screen, hesitating for the first time in a way that did not belong to him. Then he saw the messages. Short, direct, unforgiving. She's in labor. Where are you? Answer your phone. And then the last one. Mother and child are stable. The words did not register all at once. They landed slowly, each one heavier than the last, pressing into him with a force that no physical blow ever could. His breath caught, sharp and sudden, as the meaning forced its way through the fog in his mind. Labor. Child. Stable. The room seemed to shift around him, the quiet becoming suffocating, the light too bright, too harsh. He read the messages again, as if doing so would change them, as if there was still time hidden somewhere between the lines. But there was. He had missed it. The realization did not come with anger or denial. It came with something far worse, a hollow drop in his chest, like the ground beneath him had disappeared without warning. He swung his legs off the bed, standing too quickly, the movement unsteady, his mind racing to catch up with something that had already happened. She had called him, again and again, and he hadn't answered. Images forced their way into his thoughts now, uninvited, unavoidable. Ilara alone, in pain, calling him, waiting. The storm outside, the silence on the other end of the line, each image sharper than the last, cutting deeper, breaking through the walls he had built around himself for years. His hand tightened around the phone, his knuckles whitening, his breathing uneven in a way he could not control. This wasn't fear of an enemy. It wasn't the calculated tension of a deal gone wrong. This was something raw, something unfamiliar, something he had never allowed himself to feel. Regret. Real, immediate, suffocating regret. He moved without thinking, grabbing his jacket, his movements abrupt, almost violent, as if speed alone could undo what had already been done. The door slammed behind him, the sound echoing through the empty suite as he stepped into the corridor, his mind no longer focused on power or alliances or the carefully constructed world he had spent years controlling. None of it mattered. Not right now. Because somewhere across the city, behind guarded walls and silent corridors, a child had been born into his world. His child. And he hadn't been there. The elevator doors closed in front of him, the reflection staring back from the polished steel unfamiliar in a way he couldn't explain. There was no control in his eyes now, no calculated calm, only something fractured, something exposed. For the first time in a long time, Mafia Boss did not feel like the man who ruled everything around him. He felt like a man who had lost something he could never take back. And as the car sped through the storm-washed streets, cutting through red lights and empty roads, one thought pressed harder than anything else, louder than the thunder still echoing above the city. He had chosen the wrong moment. And now there was no way to choose again. The clinic did not announce his arrival with noise or chaos. It absorbed him the way it absorbed everything, quietly, efficiently, without acknowledgement. The doors opened before he reached them, guards stepping aside with silent respect, but for the first time in his life, that respect felt misplaced, almost hollow. Mafia Boss walked through the corridor with the same controlled stride he had always carried, yet something inside him was unraveling with every step. The storm outside had not fully passed. Its echo clung to the walls, to the air, to the tension coiled in his chest. Each footstep felt heavier than the last, not because of fear, but because of what waited at the end of that hallway. Room 312. The number seemed insignificant, just another door in a long line of identical ones, but it held something irreversible behind it. He stopped for a fraction of a second, his hand hovering near the handle, his breath caught in a place that refused to release it. He had faced men with guns, stood in rooms where death was a certainty, made decisions that had cost lives without hesitation. None of that had prepared him for this moment, because this was not about control. This was about something he had already lost. He pushed the door open. The room was quiet, too quiet. No machine screaming, no frantic movement, only a stillness that felt heavier than any chaos. Soft light filtered through the curtains, painting everything in muted tones, as if the world itself had lowered its voice out of respect for what had happened here. And in the center of it, on a bed that looked too fragile to hold the weight of everything surrounding it, lay Alara. She looked different. Not broken, not shattered in the way he had expected. Worse. She looked distant. Her eyes lifted slowly to meet his, and for a moment the world narrowed to that single connection. There was no relief in her expression, no anger, no tears, just something colder, something final. It was the absence of emotion that struck him the hardest, because it told him everything he needed to know without a single word being spoken. He stepped forward, but the movement felt wrong, like he was entering a space he no longer had permission to be in. His voice, when it came, lacked the certainty it had always carried. "Are you okay?" The question sounded weak, almost meaningless the moment it left him. Alara did not answer immediately. Her gaze shifted away from him, not with hostility but with quiet dismissal, as if his presence had already been reduced to something unimportant. Her arms tightened slightly, and only then did he see her. The child. Small, fragile, wrapped in soft fabric that seemed too light to contain something so significant. For a moment, Pahir forgot how to move. His eyes locked onto the tiny form, his mind struggling to process what he was looking at. This was not power, not territory, not something that could be negotiated or controlled. This was his daughter. The realization hit harder than anything before it, sharper than the regret that had driven him here. It was immediate and overwhelming, breaking through the last barrier he had built around himself. He took another step forward, slower this time, as if approaching something sacred, something that could disappear if he moved too quickly. "Can I?" His voice faltered, something that had never happened before. He cleared his throat, forcing the words out. "Can I hold her?" Alara's eyes returned to him, and this time there was something in them. Not anger, not yet. Something more guarded, more dangerous. She studied him for a long moment, weighing something he could not see, measuring something he could not influence. He felt it, the distance between them, wider than anything physical, built from a single night that had changed everything. For a second, he thought she would refuse. That would have been easier. Instead, she shifted slightly, her movements slow, deliberate, as she carefully lifted the baby and extended her toward him. The gesture was not forgiving. It was not welcoming. It was conditional. A test. He reached out, his hands uncharacteristically unsteady, taking the small bundle with a care that felt foreign to him. The weight was almost nothing, yet it grounded him instantly, pulling him into a reality he could not escape. The baby stirred slightly, her tiny face shifting as if reacting to the unfamiliar touch. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused, innocent, completely unaware of the storm she had been born into. And in that moment, something inside him broke. Not loudly, not violently, but completely. He had built his entire life on control, on power, on the belief that nothing could exist beyond his reach. But this small, fragile life, had already proven him wrong. She had arrived without him, breathed without him, existed in a moment he had chosen to abandon. He swallowed hard, his throat tightening as a weight settled in his chest, heavier than anything he had ever carried. He paused, the word catching before it could fully form. She's perfect. Alara's voice cut through the silence, quiet but sharp enough to leave a mark. Her name is Sienna. Not our daughter. Not your child. Just Sienna. The message was clear. Pahir nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on the baby, on the undeniable proof of what he had missed. Sienna, he repeated softly, the name feeling unfamiliar and yet permanent, like something he should have been there to claim but no longer had the right to. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was heavy, filled with everything that had not been said, everything that could not be undone. He stood there, holding his daughter, feeling something grow inside him that he did not know how to control. Shame. For the first time in his life, it did not make him stronger. It made him smaller. And across from him, Alara watched, her expression unreadable, her distance unwavering, as if she had already accepted a truth he was only just beginning to understand. Some moments could not be reclaimed, and some choices could never be forgiven. The city did not sleep after a night like that. It shifted, it listened, it watched, and beneath its polished surface, where power moved without permission and loyalty was bought in silence, something began to fracture. By the time the sun rose fully over the skyline, whispers had already started spreading through the underworld like a controlled fire. Not loud enough to cause panic, not clear enough to trace back, but sharp enough to cut. Pahir Voss had been absent when his heir was born. Pahir Voss had chosen a woman over his blood. Pahir Voss, the man who built his empire on discipline and control, had shown weakness. And in his world, weakness was not forgiven, it was hunted. In a private suite overlooking the financial district, Selene Marquez stood by the window, watching the city with a stillness that felt deliberate. The glass reflected her faintly, her expression calm, almost serene, but her eyes were alive with something far more calculated. A phone rested loosely in her hand, the screen dimming and lighting again as messages continued to arrive. Each one carried a different tone: concern, curiosity, opportunity, but they all pointed toward the same conclusion. The king had faltered. Her lips curved slightly, not into a smile but into something quieter, something satisfied. She turned away from the window, moving with unhurried grace, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. The room was empty, but that did not mean she was alone. In her world, presence did not require bodies. Influence moved through calls, through favors, through carefully planted truths that blurred just enough to become believable. "They're talking already," came a voice through the speaker on the table, low and cautious. Selene tilted her head slightly, as if considering the weight of that statement. "Of course they are," she replied, her tone smooth, almost amused. "Men like them don't need facts, they need doubt." A pause followed, then the voice again, more uncertain this time. "The council is asking questions. They're wondering if he's still stable enough to lead." Selene's gaze sharpened, a flicker of something colder passing through her eyes. "Good," she said softly. "Let them wonder." Across the city, in a building far older than the glass towers surrounding it, the council had already begun to gather. It was not a formal meeting. Not yet. But the men who held power did not wait for official invitations when something felt wrong. They moved when instinct told them to. And instinct was loud this morning. Pahir stood at the head of a long table, his posture as composed as ever, his expression unreadable. If anyone had walked into that room without context, they would have seen the same man who had built his empire from nothing, the same man who commanded loyalty without raising his voice. But the men sitting around him were not outsiders. They knew what to look for, and today they were looking closely. "You were unreachable last night," one of them said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but it carried weight, during a critical negotiation. Pahir's gaze did not shift. "The deal was secured," he replied evenly. "That's not the point," another voice added, sharper this time. "Control is the point, presence is the point, and you weren't present." The words hung in the air, heavier than they should have been. Pahir felt it, the shift in the room, the subtle change in how they looked at him. Not with open challenge, not yet, but with something more dangerous. Doubt. His jaw tightened slightly, the only visible sign of tension. "My personal matters did not interfere with business," he said, his tone steady, controlled. A faint scoff came from the far end of the table. "Your personal matters are becoming business," the man said. "Your wife gives birth alone while you're seen with another woman. That's not personal, that's a signal." Silence followed, thicker this time, because everyone in that room understood the truth behind those words. In their world, family was not separate from power. It was part of it. A man who could not protect his own blood could not be trusted to protect anything else. Pahir did not respond immediately. For the first time, he felt something unfamiliar pressing against the edges of his control. Not fear, not anger, something sharper. Exposure. He could feel it now, the consequences of a single decision spreading outward, touching things he had never intended it to reach. The clinic, Alara, Sienna, and now this. The door behind him opened quietly, but the sound carried through the room with unsettling clarity. A man stepped in, moving quickly but with purpose, his eyes going straight to Pahir. "There's something you need to see," he said, his voice low. Pahir's gaze flicked toward him, a silent question passing between them. The man stepped closer, holding out a tablet. On the screen, an article had already begun circulating. A blurred photo, a headline carefully crafted to provoke. Mafia heirs birth overshadowed by scandal. Pahir's expression did not change, but something inside him shifted, tightening, darkening. This wasn't random. This wasn't accidental. This was deliberate. His eyes lifted slowly, scanning the room, reading the faces of the men who now watched him with something closer to calculation than loyalty. And in that moment, he understood. This wasn't just about what he had done. This was about what someone was turning it into. And somewhere in the city, behind glass and silence, Selene Marquez stood at the center of it, pulling threads that had not yet fully revealed their design. The storm had not ended. It had only changed form. And this time, it was coming for everything. The council chamber had no windows. It never needed them. The men who sat within it did not look outward for guidance. They measured the world by what they controlled inside these walls. The room was carved from old stone and quiet authority, a place where voices rarely rose but decisions carried the weight of life and death. When Pahir Voss entered, the air shifted in a way that could not be seen but could be felt, like pressure tightening before a storm breaks. Every seat was occupied. No one had arrived late. No one had chosen absence. That alone was a message. He walked to the center without hesitation, his footsteps echoing once and then disappearing into the stillness. For years, this room had bent around him, his presence unquestioned, his authority unchallenged. Tonight, it watched him instead. The difference was subtle, but it was enough to change everything. An older man seated at the head of the semicircle leaned forward slightly, his hands folded, his gaze sharp with experience that did not forgive easily. "You understand why you're here," he said, his tone controlled, carrying neither accusation nor comfort, just expectation. Pahir held his gaze. "I do." Silence followed, not empty but heavy, filled with everything that had already been discussed before he entered. The rumors, the images, the absence, the child, the woman, all of it had arrived here before him, stripped of context, sharpened into something more dangerous than truth, interpretation. "You missed the birth of your heir," another voice said, lower, edged with something closer to contempt, "while being seen with a woman tied to a fragile alliance." The man's fingers tapped lightly against the armrest, a small, controlled rhythm. "Do you understand what that looks like?" Pahir did not respond immediately. He could feel it now more clearly than before. The shift in power, not a collapse, not yet, but a fracture. A single crack in something that had once felt unbreakable. And in this room, cracks were not ignored. They were tested. "It looks like a lapse," he said finally, his voice steady, but there was something beneath it now. Not weakness, something more deliberate, a personal failure. A murmur moved through the room, subtle but unmistakable. That was not the answer they expected, not from him. The older man's eyes narrowed slightly. "A failure," he repeated. "That's not a word you've used before." "No," Pahir said quietly, "it is." The admission did not weaken him. It did something else. It changed the rhythm of the room, disrupted the pattern they were prepared to follow. Because men like Pahir did not admit fault. They justified it. They redirected it. They buried it under power and precision. But he had not done that. And now they were watching more closely. "Your personal life is no longer separate from your authority," another council member said, leaning forward, his expression sharper. "A man who abandons his family invites questions about his discipline, his priorities, his control." He paused, letting the words settle. "And control is everything." Pahir felt the weight of those words settle into him, not as pressure, but as clarity. Because for the first time, he understood something he had ignored for too long. Control did not come from force. Not here. Not in this room. It came from perception, from the belief that he was unshakable, and that belief had been shaken. A door opened behind him, soft but precise, and a guard stepped forward, placing a folder on the table in front of the council. No one spoke as it was opened. Inside were images, headlines, fragments of a story already spreading beyond containment, the blurred outline of Selene beside him, the carefully timed release of information, the suggestion of instability. "Not proof, but enough. This is not random," the older man said, closing the folder with quiet finality. "This is a move." Pahir's jaw tightened slightly. I know. Then say it, the man replied, his voice firm now. Say what this is. The room leaned into the moment, every gaze fixed on him, waiting. Not for denial, not for deflection, for something else. For truth. Pahir inhaled slowly, the air heavy in his lungs, and for a moment everything outside this room disappeared. The clinic, Alara, Sienna, the storm, the choices he had made, the one moment he could never reclaim, it all settled into a single, undeniable understanding. This is an attack, he said, his voice no longer just steady but grounded in something deeper. Not on the Empire. He paused, his gaze moving across the room, meeting each pair of eyes without hesitation. On me. Silence followed, thicker now, charged with something new, because the admission changed the frame. It shifted the narrative from failure to threat, from weakness to target. And your response? The older man asked, his tone quieter, more dangerous. Pahir did not look away. I will correct it. How? Another voice pressed. The answer came without delay this time, without hesitation, because it was no longer something he was constructing in the moment. It was something he had already begun to understand. I stepped back, he said. The words landed harder than anything before them. The room reacted instantly, not with noise, but with tension, sharp and undeniable. That was not expected. That was not part of any strategy they had considered. For a man like Pahir Voss to say those words, it was not just a decision. It was a shift. You relinquish control, someone demanded, disbelief cutting through their composure. No, Pahir replied, his voice firm, unwavering. I reinforce it. His gaze hardened slightly, something darker settling behind his calm. By removing the vulnerability that's being exploited. The older man studied him for a long moment, weighing something far beyond the words. Then slowly he nodded once. Not approval, not agreement, recognition. You choose family, he said. Pahir didn't answer. He didn't need to. Because for the first time, it wasn't a question of power or perception or control. It was a choice. And he had already made it. The night did not warn them this time. It arrived quietly, almost deceptively calm, as if the city had decided to hold its breath. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and reflective, mirroring a skyline that looked peaceful from a distance. But inside the Voss estate, something restless moved beneath the silence. Security had doubled since the council meeting, men stationed at every entrance, every blind spot, every possible weakness mapped and reinforced. Pahir had not taken chances after what he had uncovered. Not with Alara, not with Sienna, not anymore. Still, danger did not always knock. Alara stood near the window in the nursery, gently rocking Sienna in her arms, her movements slow and instinctive. The baby had finally fallen asleep, her tiny breath soft and steady against Alara's chest. For a moment, everything felt still, almost fragile in its calm. But Alara had learned something in the past days. Peace was not the absence of danger. It was the moment before it arrived. She turned slightly, adjusting the blanket around Sienna when a faint sound broke through the silence. Not loud, not obvious, just wrong. A shift. Somewhere deeper in the house. Her body reacted before her mind could process it. She stilled completely, her breath catching as she listened. The guards outside the room hadn't moved. There were no alarms, no raised voices, and yet the air felt different, tighter. Then came the second sound. Closer. A soft click. The door. It didn't open fully, just enough. Just enough to let something in. Alara's heart began to pound, slow at first, then faster, louder, echoing in her ears as instinct took over. She stepped back instinctively, pulling Sienna closer to her chest, her eyes locked on the door as it creaked open inch by inch. A figure slipped inside. Not one of the guards. That much was clear immediately. The man moved with precision, dressed in dark clothing that blended into the shadows, his face partially covered, his presence controlled, deliberate. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't random. This was a message. Don't scream, he said quietly, his voice calm, almost detached. Alara didn't. Fear surged through her, sharp and immediate, but something stronger held it in place. Her grip tightened around Sienna, her body shifting subtly to shield the baby, every instinct screaming at her to protect, to survive. What do you want? she asked, her voice low, steady in a way that surprised even her. The man didn't answer immediately. His gaze moved to the child, observing, calculating. Then slowly he stepped closer. "Proof," he said finally. The word landed cold. Before she could react, before she could move, the door behind him burst open with violent force. The sound shattered the silence, gunfire cracking through the room like thunder as one of Pahir's guards lunged forward. The attacker moved instantly, faster than expected, reaching inside his jacket. But he never finished the motion. A second shot rang out. Precise. Final. The man collapsed before he could take another step, his body hitting the floor with a dull, lifeless sound that echoed louder than the gunfire itself. For a moment, everything froze. The air thickened, time stretching as the reality of what had almost happened settled in. Alara stood motionless, her breath uneven, her arms wrapped tightly around Sienna, who had begun to stir from the noise, a small, fragile cry escaping her. "Clear," one of the guards said, his voice sharp, scanning the room, his weapon still raised. Footsteps followed, faster, heavier. And then Pahir was there. He didn't hesitate, didn't slow. His eyes locked onto Alara immediately, scanning her, assessing, searching for any sign of harm. For the first time since she had known him, there was no control in his expression, no distance, only something raw. Fear. Real fear. He crossed the room in seconds, stopping just short of her, his voice low but urgent. "Are you hurt?" Alara shook her head, barely able to speak, her focus still locked on Sienna, on the fact that she was alive, that nothing had touched her. Pahir's gaze shifted to the body on the floor, his jaw tightening, something dark settling into his expression. He didn't need to ask questions. He already knew. This wasn't random. This was Selene. The realization burned through him with a clarity that left no room for doubt. This was never about seduction, never about distraction. This had been calculated from the beginning. She hadn't just targeted him. She had targeted his family. His weakness. His failure. His consequence. His hand moved instinctively, resting lightly against Sienna's back, as if grounding himself in something real, something he could still protect. The baby's small cry softened under the touch, her breathing settling again, unaware of how close she had come to something irreversible. Pahir's voice, when it came, was no longer uncertain, no longer fractured. It was cold. Final. She crossed the line. No one in the room questioned what that meant. Because everyone understood. This was no longer a game of power or perception. This was war. And this time, Pahir Voss would not be late. The city did not hear the war begin. There were no sirens, no headlines, no visible chaos spilling into the streets. It unfolded beneath the surface in quiet movements, in sudden disappearances, in decisions made behind closed doors where consequences were final and unseen. By the time the first whispers reached the edges of the underworld, it was already over. Selene Marquez had vanished, not fled, not negotiated, removed. The kind of silence that followed her name was not the silence of mystery, but of understanding. Everyone knew what it meant when Pahir Voss stopped waiting and started acting. But victory did not feel like triumph. The estate was quiet again, but it was not the same quiet as before. It carried the weight of what had almost been lost, what had nearly been taken in a single moment of vulnerability. Guards still stood at every entrance, their presence sharper now, more alert, as if the walls themselves had learned fear. Inside, the air felt heavier, grounded in something real, something fragile. Alara stood in the nursery, the soft light casting gentle shadows across the room. Sienna slept peacefully in her crib, her small chest rising and falling with a rhythm that felt almost sacred. Alara watched her in silence, her arms crossed lightly, not out of tension, but out of habit. Protection had become instinct. Every breath her daughter took was a reminder of what could have been taken from her, of how close everything had come to breaking beyond repair. Footsteps approached behind her, steady but slower than they once would have been. She didn't turn immediately. She already knew who it was. Pahir stopped just inside the doorway, not crossing into the room completely, as if there was still a line he wasn't sure he had the right to step over. For a moment, he said nothing. His gaze moved to Sienna, lingering there, taking in every small detail, every quiet proof that she was here, safe, alive. Then his eyes shifted to Alara. I ended it, he said quietly. The words were simple, but they carried everything behind them. Not just Selene, not just the threat, everything that had led to this moment. Alara turned slowly, her expression calm but not soft. Not yet. You didn't end it, she replied, her voice steady. You reacted to it. The distinction hung between them, sharp and deliberate. Pahir didn't argue. He didn't try to correct her because she was right. Everything he had done in the past days had been reaction, damage control, consequence, not prevention. I should have seen it earlier, he said, his voice lower now, stripped of the authority it once carried so easily. I should have chosen differently. Alara studied him for a moment, her eyes searching not for words but for truth, for consistency, for something that could hold weight beyond this moment. You didn't, she said simply. There was no accusation in her tone, no raised voice, just fact. And somehow that was harder to face than anger. Pahir stepped forward then, slowly, carefully, as if every movement needed permission. He stopped beside the crib, his hand resting lightly against its edge, his gaze dropping to Sienna again. She shifted slightly in her sleep, her tiny fingers curling instinctively, unaware of the storm that had passed over her life before she had even begun to understand it. She's stronger than I deserve, he murmured, almost to himself. Alara's gaze softened for a fraction of a second, not at him, but at the child. She doesn't know what you deserve, she said quietly. She only knows what you give her. The words settled into him, deeper than anything else she had said, because they weren't about the past. They were about what came next. He turned slightly, looking at her fully now. I'm stepping back, he said, from the council, from operations, not completely, but enough. He paused as if weighing the meaning of his own decision. Enough to be here. Alara didn't respond immediately. She let the silence stretch, let the weight of his words exist without rushing to accept or reject them, because this wasn't something that could be decided in a moment, not after everything. You don't get to trade power for forgiveness, she said finally, her voice calm but firm. That's not how this works. I know, he replied. And this time he did. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with something uncertain, something fragile, something that had not yet taken shape, not reconciliation, not separation, something in between. Alara stepped closer to the crib, adjusting the blanket gently around Sienna, her movements careful, instinctive. When she spoke again, her voice was softer but no less clear. I need time. Pahir nodded, the motion slow, deliberate. You'll have it. No promises, no demands, just space. And for the first time since the storm had begun, that was enough. As the night settled quietly around them, the city outside continued to move, unaware of the shift that had taken place within these walls. Power had changed, not in the way the underworld would measure it, but in a way far more difficult to define. Pahir Voss no longer stood at the center of everything. He stood at the edge of something he had almost lost. And whether he would ever fully step back into it would depend not on the empire he had built, but on the family he had nearly destroyed. In the crib, Sienna stirred softly, her small hand reaching into the air as if searching for something unseen. Alara gently took it, her fingers wrapping around hers with quiet certainty. Pahir watched, and for the first time, he did not try to take control of the moment. He simply stayed, because this time staying was the only thing that mattered.